Okay, so we've been talking about exploration and colonization for the past couple weeks, and we are here at our last part of that unit, that last lesson in the unit. And it is a difficult subject that we need to talk about, and that is slavery and servitude and the triangular trade and the Middle Passage. Now, I know this is a very, very complex issue. I know it is a very difficult issue to talk about. But I am a firm believer that those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. So we have to talk about it in hopes that something like this doesn't happen again. Plus, I think that by talking about it, we remember the souls and the lives of those unfortunate enough to be involved in slavery, okay, to be sold into slavery. So I know it is a difficult subject, but it is an important one nonetheless, if nothing else, to prevent it from happening again in the future. Okay. Now we're going to start as we go through these notes. Please be sure you are filling in the attached worksheet. Okay. If I go too fast, feel free to pause the video. Okay. And you can type and fill in as we go. But please work at your own pace. Okay. Now, the growth of plantation based agriculture in the hot, humid coastal lowlands of the southern colonies required cheap labor on a large scale. Okay, so the plantations down south require a lot of workers. All right. Now, before we get into the actual discussion of slavery itself, even though slavery becomes associated with the South, okay, because that's where the plantations are, I would like to point out that if you went at a certain period of time, no matter where you were in the United States, whether you were in New England or whether you were in the middle colonies, and definitely, of course, down south, you would find slaves. Okay, even if it was simply a slave market, or that's where the slaves came in, like they came in to the trading centers of the middle colonies. Okay, or maybe they came in along the coast of New England, you would find slaves up and down the east coast of the United States. Over time, the New England colonies and the middle colonies are going to abolish slavery itself. Now, they might not abolish the slave trade, but they're going to abolish slavery itself. And it will be, like I said, associated with the South because that's where the plantations are. All right. But like I said, I would like to point out at some point in time in the history of this country, you would find slaves all up and down the East Coast. Now, remember, we talked about this when we were talking about Jamestown. Okay. At first, some of the labor needs, especially in Virginia, were met by indentured servants. Okay. Now, an indentured servant is a poor person. Since we're dealing with the English colonies, we say they're from England, Scotland, and Ireland. Although, to be honest with you, you could have indentured servants from other places as well. But we tend to focus on England, Scotland, and Ireland. They agreed to work for a period of time in return for their passage or relief from debts. Okay. And we talked about this, like I said, when we were talking about Jamestown. All right. So they agreed to work for their passage or relief from debts. Usually it was a period of 7 years. Okay. That's what it says in this advertisement right there, work for 7 years. Okay. Then once you were done with your term of service, you got your freedom. And you also got some land of your own and some tools so that you could start your own farm or your own house. All right. Especially early on when we are trying to get settlers here and we are trying to increase the population of the colonies. Okay. Now, over time, this becomes very, very expensive. All right. If you're the employer, all right, every 7 years, you're looking for a new workforce, which means you have to pay for their passage and then you'll be required to give them land at the end of their service. And we talked about, did corruption occur? Yeah, probably. Okay, there were probably indentured servants that got to the end of their term and then their owners, their masters said, you haven't worked hard enough for me, so I'm going to add 2 more years. Okay, so stuff like that happened as well. Eventually, like I said, this becomes very, very expensive. all right, because you got to pay for the passage and you got to give them land. Every 7 years, you're looking for a new workforce. So eventually, that workforce is replaced by the forcible importation of Africans. That's going to become the most cost effective way of getting enough workers for these plantations. Okay. Now, we also talked about this. Um, they tried to enslave the Native Americans first. The Native Americans would often fight back. And of course, the Native American population gets decimated by disease. Africans had been in contact with Europeans longer and had begun to build up immunity to some European diseases. Native Americans had not. So when Native Americans come into contact with Europeans, they easily catch European diseases, and those diseases are just going to significantly decrease Native American population. Okay, so that's why we end up looking at Africa and not enslaving Native Americans. We also talked about this when we were talking about Jamestown. Some of those Africans worked as indentured servants. They earned their freedom. Okay, they lived as free citizens, and some of them go on to own slaves themselves. Okay, but this is not the common practice. I said you could probably count the number of times this actually happened on one hand. As time goes on and people begin to see this happening, laws are quickly passed to prevent it from happening. So it's just a very, very few that are considered as indentured servants and earn their freedom and own slaves themselves. Okay, this does not last very, very long. Over time, larger and larger numbers of enslaved Africans are forcibly brought to the southern colonies. Okay. And yes, the South is going to be associated with slavery. But again, I would say we can't forget a lot of those slaves are coming in through New England and the middle colonies and then making their way down south. Okay. Now, how does this all begin? Well, as contact with Europeans increased, Africans began to trade conquered slaves to Europeans for goods. When African tribes would go out to war, they would often take the losers prisoners, and then they would trade those prisoners to Europeans for goods. Okay. Now, originally, Europeans had come to Africa with thoughts of gold. Okay. Once again, these stories, kind of like the stories that we hear about in the New World, that there are all these piles of gold laying everywhere and piles of jewels and stuff like that laying everywhere around Africa. Europeans came expecting, oh, we're just going to grab all this stuff up. And of course, when they get there, that's not true. But they do find a new commodity, the African people. Okay. Now, the trade route that connects Africa, Europe, and the New World together has a special name. We call it the triangular trade or the triangular trade route. All right. It is a transatlantic trading network. It crisscrosses the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. That's why we call it transatlantic. And it connects the New World to Europe, Europe to Africa, Africa to the New World. Now, I'm going to show you a map in a few minutes that actually illustrates it, and you can see it is clearly a triangle. Okay, you can draw a line from the New World to Europe, from Europe to Africa, and from Africa back to the New World, and you can see the shape of a triangle. Okay, now what goes on these voyages? Okay, we're going to start with the New World. Okay. In the New World, we get raw materials. Okay, think cotton, your cash crops. Okay, things like that. So we're going to take these raw materials from the New World and send them to Europe. Okay, rum is another commodity. Tobacco, cotton, cash crops. You know, all these raw material, all these New World goods go from the New World to Europe. In Europe, those raw materials are changed into finished products. Okay, and those finished products are then sent from Europe to Africa. Okay, things like textiles, guns, and other goods. Okay, so we get raw materials from the New World to Europe. We get finished products from Europe to Africa. And in Africa, those finished products are traded for slaves, and the slaves are sent to the New World to work on the plantations to produce those raw materials that are then sent to Europe. And the process goes all over again. Okay, so we get raw materials from the New World to Europe, they're changed into finished products from Europe to Africa. Those finished products are traded for slaves, and then the slaves go to the New World to work on the plantations to produce the raw materials, and the process starts all over again. Okay. Now, one of the saddest things about this is because of European greed, okay, some people are quick to point out that, the African tribes sold each other into slavery, but that's because they had become dependent. Oh, here's my map before I move to the next slide. Here's my map, okay? So you can see here comes the raw materials out of the New World to Europe. Those raw materials are changed to finished products. Those finished products are sent down to Africa where they're traded for slaves. And then those slaves are sent back to the New World, and the process starts all over again. And you can see, if you follow the pointer, that this looks like a triangle. All right. And you can also see how long it takes, because it takes about 1 to 2 months from the raw materials to get from the Americas to Europe, 1 to 2 months from the finished products to get from Europe to Africa, and then 1 to 3 months for the slaves to get from Africa to the New World. Okay. So at maximum, we're talking about 7 months for this whole thing to work itself out. Okay. Now, back to what I was saying just a second ago. Some people are quick to point out that Africans sold each other into slavery, that African tribes sold each other into slavery, which is true. But the sad thing is they did that because they had become dependent on European goods. Okay. The African slave trade was dependent on other African tribes conquering one another for slaves, and those tribes had become dependent on the European goods, which is why they ended up selling the slaves into slavery. Now, as we were saying, the trade route that connects the Americas to Europe, Europe to Africa, Africa to the Americas is the triangular trade. Within that trade route is a very, very important part, the Middle Passage. Okay. Now, the Middle Passage is called the Middle Passage because it is considered the middle part of the trade. Okay. It is specifically referring to the fact that slaves were brought to the colonies under terrible circumstances. It is the middle leg of the transatlantic trade triangle. It is the journey of slaves from Africa to the Americas. Okay. And it is a horrible, horrible experience. Okay. I would highly recommend the miniseries Roots. Roots does a very, very good job about visually presenting the Middle Passage. If you've ever seen the movie Amistad by Steven Spielberg, Amistad's version of the Middle Passage is particularly moving, okay, and how horrible it is. All right. So this Middle Passage is considered the middle part of the transatlantic trade triangle, and it specifically refers to the voyage from Africa to the New World that brought the slaves to the Americas. Now, during this part of the voyage, European traders branded Africans with red-hot irons for identification purposes. They then packed them into the dark holds of large ships, okay? And this is a very, very famous illustration of what it was like in the hold of one of those ships, okay? And each one of these marks right here is a person, all right? Now, this visual does a good job of showing you how crowded. You can see that the slaves were put side by side. What it doesn't show you is that they were often placed on like bunk beds, and not only are that many slaves packed in there side by side, but you also have them on top of each other, okay? In rows. All right. So there are probably many, many more slaves in there than you realize in this illustration. Okay. So they've been branded, they've been crammed into the dark holds of the ship, and now the voyage begins. Okay. And this is where things get horrible. One of the questions that I used to ask on a quiz, in one word, describe for me what the voyage was like. And I would basically accept anything that was bad. It was bad. It was horrible. It was terrible. It was gross. Okay. Because all these people are crammed in there together. Now, besides the whippings and the beatings, okay, because they are crammed in there together, disease sweeps through the vessel. By vessel, I mean ship. In fact, that's part of the reason they cram so many slaves in there is they know some of them are going to die on the way over. Okay? It is hot down there. It stinks. It smells of blood. It smells of sweat. It smells of excrement, which is human waste. Okay? Because the passengers down there live in their own vomit and their own waste. Okay? Not only are they chained side by side, but like I said, they're chained on top of each other. And of course, if a slave gets sick, and a lot of them do because this is their first time in the ocean, they get seasick. If they get sick and throw up, then that vomit is going to go on the people beside them. It's going to go on the people below them. Okay. It is just a nasty, nasty, almost indescribable voyage. And the natural processes of life go on too. Okay. African women that were captured before they were sold into slavery that were pregnant. Some of them give birth on the voyage over. Okay. Um, uh, Slaves that die are chained down there. So you could have a decomposing corpse down there. I mean, it is so, so horrible. This voyage, this middle passage from Africa to the Americas. Now, whether they died from disease or from cruel treatment of merchants or they committed suicide, okay, many of them committed suicide by jumping in the ocean. This is one of the most, to me, this is one of the most emotional scenes of Amistad. Is during the voyage, they would bring the slaves on top of the ship to give them fresh air, to give them sunshine, and to give them exercise by basically allowing them to walk around the top of the ship. One of the female slaves had just given birth, and she doesn't quite know what's going to happen when the voyage is over, but she knows it's not good. So as the crew is distracted, you see her slowly back up with her baby in her arms to the side of the boat, and then she just falls over and she commits suicide and she kills her newborn baby as well because she would rather do that than face whatever is coming at the end. And like I said, that to me is one of the most emotional scenes of that movie. Up to 20% or more of Africans aboard each slave ship died during the trip to the New World. That's why they cram so many slaves in there, as they expect the slave owners, or I'm sorry, the slave traders expect 20% are going to die, and they still need a profit. So that's why they cram so many in, is they still want to make money when the trip is over. Now, when the trip is over, okay, as bad as the middle passage is, do not assume that the horror is over, okay? Because those that were lucky enough to survive the trip enter into a life of hard labor in North America. About 90% of those that are enslaved are actually going to work in the fields. They're going to work outside of the plantations, okay? They're going to work in the fields. They're going to be the main workforce on the plantations. The other 10% are going to work in the planters' houses. Okay. Now, what's interesting is the scholarship that has come out about this 90-10 split. There are some people that would say, I would much rather work in the house. Okay. It would be less stress. It would be less arduous than working in the field because you're working in the house. There are stories, that the slaves in the house are treated better than the slaves in the plantation, that they become part of the family because they're seen as servants and things like that. And I'm not saying that's not true. That is certainly possible that could have happened. But there are also slave narratives out there that the people that worked in the houses had a much rougher time, because if they messed up, they were right under the watchful eye of the owners, and they were more likely to be punished. Okay, as hard as it was outside working, okay, as in terms of how physical it was, and you're working in all kinds of temperature and you're doing all this hard labor and stuff like that, it was much easier to blend in with the people outside. Okay, and if you made a mistake or something like that, it was easier to go unnoticed than if you worked inside. Okay, so in some cases, the 10% that are working inside receive harsher treatment because they are under the direct supervision of the owners. Okay, now my comment to all that is, whether or not you're working inside or whether or not you're working outside, okay, you're still enslaved, and we need to remember that. All right, it doesn't really matter if you're the 90% inside or the 10%, or the 90% outside of the 10% inside. At the end of the day, you are still a slave. You are still going to have your freedom curtailed. Okay, whatever position you think is the best one, whether it's outside or inside, you're still going to be enslaved. You're still not going to have your freedom. Okay, now, like I said, when the Middle Passage is over, you enter into a life of hard labor, whether it's inside or outside. You are subject to harsh treatment. Okay, slave owners would whip and beat their slaves, especially if they considered them disobedient or disrespectful. That's why some of the scholarship we see has this 10% that are working inside being treated more harshly than those treated outside, because they, like I said, are directly under the supervision, and they can be whipped and beaten easier for being disobedient and disrespectful. You see a picture there that is a good illustration of another horror of slavery. Families are ripped apart. Okay, husbands and wives are split up. Children and parents are split up. It is a very, very hard life, and we've got to remember that as we move through this unit. Okay, and as we move through this year, is this did happen. It is not pretty. Okay, and it is very, very difficult. Now, it begins here during colonization and exploration, but this topic of slavery is going to come up a bunch as we move from now until the Civil War, okay? And even after the Civil War, it's going to be an issue with the American Revolution. It's going to become an issue after we win the American Revolution and we try to form a new government. It keeps popping up as that government gets going. Okay, what are we going to do about slaves? Are the new states that come into this country, are they going to be slave states or free states? There are a couple of times that the country almost erupts over slavery. Okay, like the Civil War could have happened several times before 1860 over this issue. Okay, and of course we do finally get the Civil War from 1860, 1861 until 1865. So this is going to be a major, major issue that we come back to a lot as we move through the story of this country over the next several months together.